I have a reading philosophy, and that's come from a multitude of things over the years, but today I'm gonna unpack that. So this is kind of just about why I choose to read the books I read, my philosophy on buying books, and how I choose when to start a series. So let's dive into it. So this reading philosophy has three different pillars, and the first one, which is arguably the most important one, is that I do not buy books that I haven't read or books that I don't plan on rereading. I think the library is a great resource. It's free books. You can get on a list. You can read whatever you want to read. And books are expensive these days, and it doesn't make sense to me to buy a bunch of books if I don't know if I'm even gonna like it, if I'm gonna want to reread it. And so that's kind of the basis for pillar number one. Something else that I take a lot of pride in is I don't have a huge collection of books. You can kind of see my one bookshelf in the back here. But every book that's on my shelf, I want it to be beautifully curated. I want it to be where I can look at my bookshelf and pull any book off and know that I loved it. I had a great time reading it. And that's something that I can immediately reread and know that I love it. I want my bookshelves to be my favorites, my absolute favorites. And also, books are expensive. So I'm trying to be very selective in what I read. I know a lot of opposition to this is mainly because at the library you can only get books when you're at the front of the line. So obviously some really popular books can have a huge wait list, but that is why I tend to stagger what I have on hold at the library. I try to hold like 5 to 7 at the library at a time, so that say if one is waiting, I typically have another one that I'm closer to the front of the line for. And so it actually works itself out pretty well. The worst part though is that when I get multiple at a time, and then when that happens, I kind of got to figure out, okay, which one do I actually want to read? And then I try and lapse the other ones, go back to the end of the line, or sometimes Libby has a feature where it's like, deliver later, and I try and do that because one, there's other people waiting for it. Two, I don't want to get to the stage of reading where I'm halfway through and it lapses and then I have to wait to continue the story. And three, I just want to be a good library patron. There's other people waiting for those books. I'm not reading it right now. I would let them enjoy it. So be a nice library patron. Additionally, at the rate I read, if I bought every single book that I wanted to read, I would be very broke, not have enough space for it, and the paralysis of choice would set in and I would have no clue what I want to read next. So I try to be pretty selective in that, and just having a bunch of books that I haven't read yet is just like, it's crazy to me. The other opposition I get to this pillar a lot is, okay, why don't you just buy ebooks? They don't take up as much space, they can be cheaper, like then you just have it and you can reread it whenever you want. Well, it still comes to the problem of I haven't read it yet, so I don't even know if I'm gonna want to spend money on it. And I also am one of those people where it's like, if I'm gonna spend money on a book, I want the physical copy. Some people call it like, you want the trophy, which I totally get. And in the past when I bought ebooks before reading them, I have not enjoyed them, and now I just have them on my Kindle forever. I'm looking at you, Shatter Me series. It's why I tried to avoid that. So the second pillar of my 3-pillar reading philosophy is probably more controversial than the first, and it's I do not start any book series that isn't finished. Now I know what you're all thinking. That's crazy. You're gonna be late to all of the book trends, and that's something I'm very well familiar with and very used to. There are so many books that I want to get to, especially a lot of books from the last few years that I haven't read yet. I have a better reading experience when I can just go book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, and finish out the series. I like doing it in order. I'm definitely a binge reader when it comes to series. I don't like reading a book in between. I don't like refreshing my palate, as some people call it. Like, I want to dive into it, I want to be in it, and I want to follow our characters from the start all the way through the end. I also read a lot of fantasy, which means there's a ton of names, a ton of world mechanics, a ton of places, plots, subplots that I've got to keep straight, and any break in between books or any time lapsing will just damper that experience, because then I'm gonna be like, who is that? What's this place again? And I do not want that. It definitely hampers my reading experience. What comes to mind specifically is the Dark Artifices series by Cassandra Clare. I remember I read the first 2 of those books, and then the third one was coming out the following summer, or maybe in January, I don't remember. But I read the first 2 books, and then when the third one came out, I remember nothing. I didn't reread the first 2 books, and then it definitely was not as good of an experience as it would have been if I had just read the whole series in a few days or whatever it would have been. Another one of these series that was like that was Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I read the first 3 books and then I was waiting for Warstorm to come out, and when Warstorm finally came out and I finally got to read it because I was so excited about it, I was clueless on the politics, on anything related to the battle that was going on. I remember, like, obviously the main 2 characters and like the side characters and some of the plots, but there was just so much going on in that book because it's such a like politically structured book, the last one, that I just didn't get the best reading experience out of it, and I hated that. I mentioned earlier, like, I could have just reread the first 2 books or the first however many books when the last one comes out, but guys, I have so many books on my TBR that I want to get to, and if it's not even a series that I know I'm going to fully like and want to buy and potentially reread, then I'm just rereading 2 books that I may never read again, and so it's like taking places away from other books that could potentially land a spot on my TBRR, which I call my to be reread list. So that's why I don't do that. And again, like, you could argue, well, wouldn't you know if you're gonna like the series like 2 books in, 3 books in, 4 books in? Yes, I kind of have an idea, but like the ending and how stuff wraps up is a huge component of whether I like a book or not. So honestly, I'm just saving my average Goodreads rating from being down in the dumps. It's pretty low anyway. I think it's a 3.3 right now because I can be a little bit critical and I do not apologize for that. So I know some of those favorites that are really popular the last few years, like Powerless, Fourth Wing, Ninth House, any of those. Haven't read it. And I know that kind of sucks because there's a lot of books that are really popular right now. I want to engage in, the discourse and everything, but there's a lot of good books that I haven't read yet that came out recently that are a full completed series that I'd rather get to. Personally, it's just a hassle to reread books, and I want to digest the story as a whole. Sorry. The last pillar of my reading philosophy is a bit more of an explanation of why I don't read super popular books or books that just came out, and it's because I don't like hardback. I wouldn't go so far to say I hate them, but I dislike them. They're not my favorite reading experience. The corners always jab into your arms. You can't hold it well. You're trying to get comfortable in your chair, like this comfy chair that I have here, and it'll snuggle in and hold your book and, enjoy your time, but then you're getting stabbed, you're breaking your pinky in the process of holding it. It is just not enjoyable. And this is difficult for me because yes, they sit beautifully on your bookshelves. Yes, they are sturdier. Yes, almost all of the books that have exclusive content or extra scenes or anything like that comes in hardback. They have the sprayed edges, they have the exclusive covers, they run promos with Barnes & Noble and like Books A Million and places like that, and I get it. And I miss out on all of that because I want a chunky paperback. It's a no for me, paperback all the way. The other thing too with why I don't read series right when they come out is because traditionally the hardback gets published first, and it's more expensive. The publishers see how the book sells, and then depending on how it sells, they'll go and release it in paperback. So to all of you who buy the books right away, who get the hardback, who hike up those sales, I appreciate you and I owe you everything. So I'm not going to pick up a series if it's not completed, and if it just got completed, I'm not going to pick it up because the last book is still in hardback, and likely if the story is just getting completed with the final book, I probably haven't started it yet. So by the time I want to get around to that series is when it's all available in paperback, if it's all available in paperback, because I know some books do not come out like that, but that's why ebooks are a thing. And if I really, really enjoy it, then I guess I'll have to buy a hardback. It's not the end of the world, but to sum up, if I bought the first book in a series that was not completed right when it came out, it would have been a hardback book. It would be my first time reading it, and the series would not even be close to complete. And I'm basically just committing a crime against myself. It's like the absolute will never do that. Well, maybe not never, but like I will do everything in my power to avoid that. So those are the 3 main pillars, and I'm not gonna lie and say there's not some caveats with that and some exclusions and exceptions, like it's my guideline for how I choose what books I pick up, what books I put on my shelves. But of course, there are some instances where the lines get a little blurred, or my personal preference is to do it a little bit differently. Again, this is not the case all the time. I think I've broken my rules maybe a handful of times. I have these rules for a reason. They work the best for me. And like I said, it's all for my preferred reading experience and so that I can squeeze every little ounce of enjoyment out of the series that I'm reading. For example, if a series just released the last book, there's nothing stopping me from starting to read that series. Again, I've never read it yet, or I haven't read it yet, and so I wouldn't be buying it, I would be grabbing it from the library. Now, of course, when a new book comes out, there's a lot of people trying to get it from the library, and more often than not, I get thrown way at the back of the list because I'm not as up to date on books that are being released this year, just because, like I said, based on my philosophy, I'm not super up to date on that. So I could be at the back of the line for a lot of books, which is fine. It just continues to delay when I read them, and so that's another reason why I am not all on top of the brand new books. But nothing's stopping me from reading that, so a little example there. So the only thing that's stopping me from, say, buying a series that just finished the last book is, like I mentioned earlier, the last book's not going to be out in paperback yet. I haven't read it yet, I'm not gonna buy it. So if I'm really behind on the library waitlist, I'll wait until it's cooled down a little bit, and then I can jump back in once the people who love reading new releases right away have gotten their chance. And that's not a loss to me, because like I said, I have so many series that I still want to get to that are fully completed. They're out in paperback if I want to buy them after I finish reading them. And there's no shortage of books here, guys. Like, there's so many that I want to read. There is no shortage. Trust me, I will be okay. Another potential caveat depends on how you view spin-off series. So sometimes our authors love to do this. They love to wrap up a series, make it perfect, you know, leave our characters in a good spot, or maybe not a good spot. And then we think it's like a finished trilogy, and oops, there are gonna be 2 more books. Or oops, we're writing a spin-off series, it's 3 books. Etc., etc. So that's kind of some of the gray area I was talking about earlier, and it's a little different how I approach that. If the spin-off series follows different characters, or it takes place a few years in the past, in the future, you know, like, for example, I think it's like the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. There is the main trilogy, and then there's a few that take place a few years later. Granted, I did not finish reading Mistborn yet, and I haven't read the spin-off, so don't quote me on any of this, but from my understanding, it takes place in the future. You follow different characters, but same world. In cases like that, the spin-off series, I would not wait for that to be finished to read the main trilogy. Now, that also can pose a risk if I, say, forget some of the world mechanics, if I forget maybe the main plot points of the original trilogy. But I found that authors tend to give readers a pretty good refresher in the beginning of spin-off series. Like, they'll introduce a scene which kind of explains some of the mechanics. If it's anything to do with fantasy, they'll like maybe talk about the government system a little bit, you know. Normally, I find that because I've read it, stuff will start to come back to me, so I don't really consider spin-off series something that I have to wait for. So an example of this is the Shatter Me series. I mentioned it earlier, but I know they are coming out with another spin-off series following the younger brother of one of the main characters, and so it's far in the future. It's still kind of a link between the two, but for example, if I hadn't read that series, that probably wouldn't keep me from starting it. But at the same time, like, if there's some overlap there because it has a chance for a main character to show up in that one, maybe some of those get a little gray. Again, like I said, this is a gray area, so if I've already read the main trilogy, like, nothing I can do about it. If I'm in the middle of, say, the first book and I see that there's going to be a spin-off that really closely aligns with the main trilogy, I might stop reading it. Okay, don't hate me, I might. It's just like I said, it's all for my enjoyment and how I want to engage with the story. It's how I want my reading experience to be. Another great example is The Hunger Games, a series that in my opinion can do no wrong. And we all know Queen Suzanne is dropping another prequel. She dropped this one, which we all know about by now. But in my opinion, you don't have to read the main trilogy in order to understand this book. I mean, I would absolutely recommend you read the trilogy first, but it's a prequel. It follows different characters. Of course, like, it gives some background to President Snow, but it's not like if I don't read the first trilogy, I won't understand anything. So in cases like this, I will never argue with Suzanne about her book. She could write a book about every tribute ever, and I would probably read all of them. And I know we have Haymitch's book coming out soon, and so a great example of main trilogy is over, she's writing some prequels, but I obviously didn't. This came out later, I was already done with this series, so that's kind of the ones I can't control. But again, like, it's different characters. Of course, like, President Snow is in it, but this is an example of one where I am not as upset over it because, one, I probably watched the Hunger Games movies multiple times a year. I probably will reread it like once every 2 years. I just finished my reread of the series earlier this year. I think it was in October. So like this is a series that I will have to get my memory wiped in order to forget. So she could write whatever she wants. She could announce that she's doing a million more books, and I'm completely fine with that. And in a similar vein, if Neil Shusterman decides to write 5 more books in the Scythe trilogy or in the Scythe world, I'd read it. I wouldn't be super pleased about it, but I would read it still, you know. I mean, I try to avoid it, and that's kind of why I have these guidelines and these pillars, but I get it, man. I get it. So the last caveat pertains specifically to any book that is nonfiction or faith-based or religion, anything like that, because obviously they're not readily available at too many libraries. It's pretty niche, so a lot of times if you want to read something like that, you need to straight up buy it. Also with those books, I know that I like to do a lot of underlining and marking and taking notes, and so I more often than not will just buy that flat out before I've read it. So this definitely breaks pillar number 1. But again, this is an exception and a caveat. And so a great example is Atomic Habits by James Clear and The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. So Atomic Habits, when I knew I wanted to read this, I knew that if I really wanted to implement it and get the best out of this book, that I would want to reference it and go back and look at some passages as I was trying to incorporate more of his principles into my life. And so I bought it. It is hardback, which again, not my favorite thing in the world, but it was at that point where I'm like, okay, it's a hardback. And this is a book I would just mainly use for reference. I don't know if I'd read back through the full thing. And of course, like I said, it's nonfiction. It's a bit different than, you know, getting cozy with a really amazing, immersive fantasy series. And then the next book is The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. And this one, of course, it's not one I think you can find at your library, at least not at mine. And so I bought this. I knew it was going to be a book that I really enjoyed, mainly because I love John Mark Comer's writing. That's another part of my reading philosophy that we'll get into in another video. But John Mark Comer, love his writing. It was easy for me to just pick this up. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me as I talked about my reading philosophy and the pillars that are involved and how I decide what books I want to get to next. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button if you want to see more from me, or hit that like button if you enjoyed listening to me talk about all of these things. And I look forward to seeing you next time. That was so stressful.